And so I see my role as really just trying to give you a bit of a picture of what's in the budget, some of the key challenges related to the budget, and also to finish off with how you can get involved in the budget process. So that's what I hope to do. So next slide. Yeah, so that's, I'll just touch on the basics in the budget and give an overview, as I mentioned, and then talk about some of the key challenges, community needs, which the city serves and are pressing, I'm sure you're aware of, and also the challenge in terms of the gap that the budget, the city's facing in terms of balancing its budget. So just a little bit in terms of budget basics. Obviously, the budget is the city's financial plan for the upcoming year, for 2016, in terms of what it's going to spend and what revenues it will get. And there are different components of the budget. There's the operating budget, which is really the spending to support day-to-day services and programs, and a range of different programs, of course. And then there's the capital budget, which is our investments in the city's assets or the city's infrastructure, its transit lines and its roads and bridges, etc. And then there's a third part, which is called the rate-supported budget, which is basically the water, provision of clean water by the city, the waste management that the city does, and the Toronto Parking Authority, and that's funded through separate rate charges to households and residents. Next one. So just a few quick terms that you'll see when you wade through budget documents, if you choose to do so. Cost shared. There are cost shared programs at the city, and that just means that the city shares the cost with other levels of government. And so examples would be shelters or daycare, which Jane will talk about childcare later. Surplus and deficits, you've probably heard those terms. A surplus is when revenues are higher, revenues exceed the expenses, and that's a good situation, you've got money left over. And deficits are the opposite, of course, when expenses are higher than revenues coming in. And the city's not allowed to run a deficit. There's a provincial law which forbids that, so the city's required to, at the end of the day, balance its spending and its revenues. And really it has a couple of ways of doing that. It can increase its revenues, taxes or user fees, or it can manage its expenses, try to reduce its expenses through service changes or efficiencies. So a word about the budget approval process. City staff develop a proposed budget, and it gets presented to the budget committee, which is a subset of city councillors, and the public, you, have an opportunity to speak to the budget committee and make recommendations or raise concerns. And then the budget committee discusses the budget in light of the input they get from the public. They take some votes and they recommend a budget to the executive committee, and then the executive committee in turn discusses and debates and recommends a budget to city council. So I hope I got that more or less correct. I'm sure the councillors here will correct me if I'm saying anything.
Excellent.
Okay. Yes?
The budget committee hasn't met and decided yet?
The budget committee has started to meet. They have not made their final decision. No. And I think the next slide might just give a little bit more. This gives the timeline, and so you can see that we're at January 11th. So the budget committee's met 4 times, and then public deputations are the rest of this week, Tuesday to Thursday, and then the budget committee meets a couple more times later in January, and then the executive committee and council meet in February. So, next slide. Thanks. So the rate budget, remember I was talking about the rate supported budget, it has a slightly different timeline than the capital and operating budgets, and I believe it was approved by council in early December, and council agreed to some increases in water rates and garbage collection rates as well. Next slide. So I'll talk a little bit about the capital budget. I already mentioned the capital budget deals with investments in existing or new infrastructure, repairing and building infrastructure like transit, roads, community centers, libraries, water sewer facilities, etc. Next slide, please. So this is where capital spending goes, and you can see that the bulk of capital spending, and this is the capital plan for the next 10 years, and it goes to transit, transportation, which I suppose is roads and bridges, and then the other category is parks, recreations, facilities, community centers, buildings, those sorts of things, recreation centers, libraries. And then the blue section is the rate-supported budget, which I talked about. So that's to support the water system and collection of waste and parking, totaling $33.5 billion over 10 years, not 10 years. Next slide. And where does the money come from for investments in capital, for the capital budget? Here you can see that, again, there's a whole bunch of different sources, but the light blue is that rate-supported money, which goes only to water, garbage, and parking. Some money comes from, you can see on the right side, federal and provincial transfers, money from the federal and provincial government, about 20%, and then a chunk of money is funded through debt, through the city borrowing money to invest in infrastructure and paying it back over time. So that gives you a bit of a picture of that. Next slide. So 33 billion over 10 years sounds like a lot of money, but actually that's not enough to meet the city's priorities in terms of capital investments. And here you see the lower part of the iceberg, the $22 billion, which is not currently funded. These are investments that need to be made in relation to transit, Toronto community housing, George Street revitalization is shelter, I believe, that's being rebuilt. So the city has a gap there in terms of trying to find funding for that $22 billion. And you probably remember that the mayor proposed a Build Toronto Fund, which is a 0.5% increase on property tax, increasing by 0.5% each year over the next 5 years. And I think that would raise, by the 5th year, about $360 million, which still would be a step in the right direction, but it wouldn't fully fund, I don't believe, the outstanding